Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. I'm Brandon Jaffe. Join us as we explore relationship and mental health issues by weeding out the trends in the mental health industry to uncover what truly works in improving our emotional well-being and relationships. At Inspired Resolutions Counseling, we specialize in providing interventions and resources for families with teens, focusing on topics such as teen mental health, parenting challenges, and family dynamics.
I feel like I should have done today's podcast a little bit earlier in my podcast career. And this discussion comes about because I often talk to parents about the damage that yelling, screaming, putting your children down just because you're angry causes in the parent-child relationship. And that often leads to a really interesting discussion because parents will come to me and say, look, I'm not yelling. I'm not speaking mean. But I keep getting accused of yelling. And I usually tell them, look, we're not going to take fully our child's assessment of whether or not we're yelling. Because if you're telling them something that they don't want, sometimes they'll accuse you of yelling. But it's good to pay attention to the patterns of what they're experiencing from you and be honest with yourself. The first subject that I'm going to talk about today is going to be a stern voice versus a mean voice versus a permissive voice. Now, I had an interesting conversation with somebody. I was telling them that based on what I had observed and what they were describing in their life, they were being permissive just in their tone of voice and in the words that they were using to parent their child when their child was doing something that was wrong, that was not something good. That confused them. Their response was, well, Brandon, you told me not to yell. You told me to put the relationship first. So I'm trying to be nice. And so I had to take a step back and really listen to the struggle they were having because they were trying so hard to be influential, to do the healthy, the right thing. And so I let them know, look, having a stern voice isn't something I'm against at all. There are going to be times that having a stern voice, either because there's something dangerous going on or because it's something that is incredibly defiant. A stern voice is not the same as a mean voice, which is not the same as a permissive voice. And right now, even as I say that, I know how easy it's a slippery slope to try to delineate the three things. And so let's get permissive voice out of the way. Look, if your child is being completely defiant as lying, as cheating, as sneaking out, or doing something actively against you and the values of your home, it's okay to have a stern voice. Look, I don't agree with this. I'm not okay with what you're doing. I'm not going to allow this. The stern voice doesn't have to turn into a yell, and it doesn't have to turn into something where you're vile, you're spitting venom. A stern voice can still be cool, calm, and collected. The other day, my daughter had been asking over and over again if she could have something, and I told her no. And she proceeded to go ahead and grab it anyways, and I caught her, and I saw what she had grabbed and what she had done, and I said, no, I told you you are not allowed to do that. And then I proceeded to follow through the boundary, and I took the object away, and because she had crossed the boundary, I threw it away. That was preceded by her telling me that I was yelling at her. That was preceded by her telling me that she's young, so that I had made her really sad and that I was mean, and she cried. And I let her cry. I didn't get any more angry. I didn't explain myself more. I didn't keep going on and on. I didn't tell her it's not fair that she's crying. I didn't do anything. And eventually she came up to me for a hug, and she wanted me to hold her. Because I had already followed through with the boundary, I did hold her. And I had both empathy and sympathy for her. I know what it's like to do the wrong thing and then feel really crummy, even if you kind of don't agree with the thing. I remember what it's like to be young. I know what it's like to lose your cool and get angry. I know what it's like to lose your cool and cry when you're young, and actually even as an adult. But I did my best to not actually use a mean voice when I was being accused of being mean. And it was a very short exchange, and we moved on with our day, and it was not a big deal. It wasn't very memorable for her at all. When I say a mean voice versus a stern voice, for some people that's going to be really hard to figure out. When I'm stern, I might be to the point. I might be a little bit louder than I normally would, and there might be some curtness behind my voice. But that's much different than crossing that line into nagging in a mean way, into maybe throwing some insults in there. And then there's just that way that we can talk, that venom, that, oh, I hate you type vibe that we can put in there that should never be a part of us communicating with a loved one, especially our children. The stern voice is a tool. It is important. We might use it to follow through with boundaries. We might use it to set boundaries. We might use it to stop our child from damaging something or harming themselves. It might just be an expression because we're fed up and we are struggling. And so the stern voice is a part of communicating what you're feeling in the moment. I'm cool with that. Now, a stern voice doesn't keep up. It's for the moment and for the moment only. A mean voice lasts longer. A mean voice is full of sarcasm later on, and there's little jabs later on. The mean voice often turns into mean behavior beyond the necessity of communicating during the issue. The permissive voice is fine when you're being permissive, when you're giving permission. But I found, especially when I'm working with parents who have younger children, they are doing this odd thing where they will say the thing that they want, right? No, you can't do that. But the voice is this kind of sing-song permissive, maybe even a voice that makes it seem funny. Your child spills milk. I'm fine with the, hey, honey, that's okay. There's no need for a stern voice. It was an accident. Honey, that's okay. You know what? Let me help you pick that up. It's okay that you spilled the milk. That's permissive voice used during a parenting exchange. Hey, it was an accident. There's nothing being done that's wrong. There's no need for a lesson here. There's no need for a stern voice. Definitely no reason to be mean. And so that's an example where a permissive voice, I think, is good. Your child has been told over and over again to stop doing the defiant behavior. And then they do it again, and then they maybe do it in front of people and are thwarting your authority by throwing it in your face. And you giggle and laugh and say, oh, honey, come on now. You know you shouldn't be doing that. Oh, the problem with that, especially at a young age, is that even though you are technically saying you shouldn't do that, what you're doing is you're using a permissive voice incorrectly and during the wrong situation. That is time for the stern voice. When you do that, whether they're small or older, what happens is you might, and you probably are, reinforcing that unhealthy, negative, or bad behavior. And I know for some people it can be confusing. I've worked with a few parents who really struggled with getting an authoritative role in the child's life. An example would be, let's say you have, and it's not always the mother, but let's say you have a mother who's in a marriage where dad's kind of overbearing and mom is the caretaker, and in an effort to survive, maybe is really permissive and has a really light way about her. Sometimes when that's the dynamic in a family, you might see that the mom's constantly using a permissive voice, even when trying to parent. Permissive voice to her husband, permissive voice. No matter what she's communicating, she's trying to be light and soft. And then what happens is the children and the other parent walk all over her. The dynamics go far beyond just the language that she uses. But I can remember a few instances where I worked on the difference between stern voice, mean voice, and permissive voice. And when I'm working with this type of client, often they struggle with the idea that there might be a difference between stern and mean. And so they really struggle to use the stern voice because they are so afraid of being mean. And so they just get stuck in a permissive voice no matter how much they're being taken advantage of or disrespected or just walked all over. In just training them to practice the differences in voice uses, what happens is other areas of their life, they have aha moments and they can put into practice some more healthily assertive behaviors into their lives. That's an example where permissive voice use becomes really unhealthy. as you assess yourself, there's got to be a level of honesty with yourself first. A good indication that you've gone into mean voice is pay attention to your internal process. Pay attention to whether or not you're building resentments or you're just trying to get business done. I'm just trying to get this message across. I don't have exceptional, huge feelings going on and on and on as I communicate my frustration or anger. When you have a huge internal response, a lot of anger, it might be a good time to take a break. Be careful with your communication or stop communicating for a minute so that you can kind of get your wits about you and plan what you want to say in an assertive manner without crossing over into that mean voice. If you are somebody who constantly reverts to permissive voice during times that you really should be taking control in your parenting, then I suggest that you kind of ask yourself and write down, what am I afraid of? How did I get here? And then write down what a mean voice would include, what it would look like, and what just an assertive or stern voice would look like. And as you do that, you're going to have to practice it. You're going to have to get outside yourself, look in the mirror, and do some practicing and write down real world examples that you've experienced or potentially will experience in the future. I think that knowing and understanding the difference between stern voice, mean voice, and permissive voice is essential for all parents. When I'm discussing these issues, I often also get into an interesting conversation about sympathy and empathy. I can't tell you how often I have parents come in truly worried saying, I think that my child might be a sociopath. They don't have sympathy. They don't have empathy for me, for my partner, for my spouse, for other people. And as I dig back the layers, and it's been very, very rare that I've actually ran across somebody who I had to refer on because of the severity of their inability to have sympathy or certain feelings and empathy. But I think sometimes parents look past and don't intentionally teach things like sympathy and then teach something that's different but similar, which is empathy. And it's important to understand sympathy is when you pity or have compassion for somebody and their hardships or their difficult times. Empathy is when you either attempt to put yourself in their shoes or you can put yourself in their shoes. And neither one is better. It's just sympathy is sometimes appropriate for certain situations and empathy is appropriate for other certain situations and relationships. And we should be teaching both as parents. We should be teaching by modeling it. We should be teaching by giving explanations of it. When we're expressing it to our children, not all the time, but at times, we should be telling them why we're expressing what we're expressing. And a healthy parent should display both, even when, or maybe especially when, they are having a frustrated moment or an angry moment or a crisis with their child. You can both hold boundaries and express sympathy or attempt to show empathy. Being intentional about sympathy and empathy is key, especially if you recognize that you're starting to resent a loved one, especially your child. And remember, the moment you start building a resentment, it is on you. It is on you to change and get rid of that resentment. Now, an example of empathy is when we use that reflective or clarifying language. Your child comes home and they tell you something terrible thing that happened in their day, and you use language like, hey, you know what? I think that I'm hearing you say this, but I'm not totally sure. Can you help me understand? Or clarifying, I hear you saying this, but that's not fitting the situation. Am I understanding you correctly? And it's that very intentional, I call it being obliviously curious. It's that curiosity language that I really am going to put time, effort, and energy into hearing you. I'm going to use active listening. I'm going to make sure that I actually hear you, and I'm going to do my best to learn enough from you so that I can put myself in your shoes and not understand what should be done, right? And advice giving. I'm just going to try my best to put myself in your shoes in terms of what you're experiencing and feeling. Another empathetic response that I think most parents can do more of is, hey, this difficult thing that you're sharing with me, even though we have some serious conversations that we need to have, thank you. Thank you for trusting me. And that's an empathetic response because it speaks to walking truly alongside them, trying to truly understand it, saying, hey, I right now am making your internal process, your thoughts, your feelings so important that I'm going to understand enough to put myself in your shoes. Now, sympathy examples, I remember as a child more sympathetic examples. My parents were amazing, and I can remember many times that my parents would send cards and flowers, and I can remember that I was supposed to and had to write thank you notes for any presents that I got. And showing sympathy doesn't mean you fully understand necessarily. You might not. But it's those important habits of, I'm going to send you a card of flowers during your tough time. I'm going to make sure you know that I acknowledge you are going through a rough time. I am going to make the call, send the text. I'm going to sign up for the meal train to help you out. I'm willing to give you a ride somewhere because you're having a hard time and don't have a ride where you need to go. It's the favors, it's the help that you might give. It's that acknowledgement. That's sympathy. That's the sympathy skills. And they can go hand in hand, and they can be done and given at the same time. And there's definitely some blurry lines between the two. I don't want to get too caught up in a debate as to whether this is sympathy or empathy. But as parents, it's essential. This should be a discussion. This should be something that we intentionally model. This should be something that we encourage. This should be something that we help our kids do. Don't assume that they know. I mean, it's mind-blowing sometimes the assumptions parents make. They assume the kids know certain ways of being, certain manners, certain habits without intentionally teaching them. These are a few things. I think that we should model and teach the stern versus mean versus permissive voices, and we should have discussions when it becomes a problem in the home. And then we should be very intentional about teaching our kids sympathy, empathy, the difference between the two. We should be modeling it. We should be setting them up for displaying it throughout their life until they leave the nest, so to speak. I hope this helps. I hope maybe after listening to this podcast today that you might be more intentional with all of these things, and that maybe even some of you might realize, oh my gosh, I haven't been intentional in just doing that in my life. Because the more we focus on this, the more influence we're going to have in our kids' lives, the more networking for our family that we're going to be able to build, the more opportunity for pleasant and happy moments in our family.
The Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast is an Inspired Resolutions production. Hosted by Brandon Jaffe. Edited and mixed by Natalie Atkinson. Music by Natalie and Sean Atkinson. Inspired Resolutions Counseling is based in Yorba Linda, California. Whether you're interested in joining our group, seeking therapy services, or exploring more of our resources, you can find us on our website, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Inspired Resolutions Counseling.